Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of React Native Radio. This week on our panel, we have Josh Justice.
Hello, hello.
Christopher Reyes.
Hey, everybody.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. And this week, it's just us. We're going to be talking about a blog post that Josh wrote. Josh, do you want to kind of give us the 5,000 foot view or 10,000 foot view or whatever the number is supposed to be view of,
absolutely.
Of what this is about?
Yeah, when I think maybe a little bit less right now, but over the last couple of years, React Native has been controversial. People asking and wondering, should I be using it? Is it well supported? Is it not? And things like that. And when I read about trade-offs, it's very interesting because there's different ways to use React Native. And so some of the downsides that someone might say about React Native, it's like, well, actually, there's a different way to use it that those downsides go away. So I in my research, I ended up coming across 4 different approaches to React Native. There's actually a 5th one that has come out since I wrote the blog post. It was a little while back. And so I want to
interject for a minute. It looks like Narendra joined us.
Hey, Narendra.
Hey, hi, Charles. Hi, Josh.
Yeah, we're already rolling, but I thought I'd just call out your name so that people know you're here and you can chime in as you feel appropriate.
Sure.
Okay.
That was really about it. I just wanted to put a blog post together all in one place to show these 4 different ways to do React Native so that people know they can pick and choose what's best for their company.
Infinite Red is a US-based consultancy specializing in React and React Native. They do mobile app and web design and development. They are deeply involved in the React and React Native open source communities, publish the React Native newsletter with 10,000 subscribers, and are involved with the React Native core development. If you have a project and need design or engineering help from an experienced team to take it all the way from concept to completion, get in touch with Infinite Red. You can find them at infinite.red. Make sure to mention you heard about them in this ad.
Nice. Yeah, and I've looked at some of these and played with some of them. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to say about these. Do you want to just start with the first one and we'll just work our way through them, or is there more context we need for this?
Yeah, let's do it. The first one I listed was Expo because it's actually although it's not the standard way to use React Native, it is the first thing that React Native recommends in their documentation. And it's kind of the highest level of abstraction. A bunch of our listeners are probably familiar with Expo, but there's probably a bunch of folks that are new to React Native world as well. So Expo is a third-party organization that has sort of wrapped React Native and isolated you fully from the native code. And so when you're building an Expo application, you don't actually need to have Xcode or Android Studio installed. You're just working in JavaScript. And Expo has a pre-built application binary that runs on your phone when you get started. And so if you're not used to using those native development tools, you don't need to do it. So it's very much the easy way to get started. The other big thing about Expo, though, for production use, and I know Nader Dabbit really recommends Expo, at least the last time I talked to him about it. It has so much available out of the box. There's so many APIs that if you're using standard React Native, you'd need to find like third-party libraries to provide those. I'm thinking about things like push notifications and audio playback. And they automatically roll in the Maps API. I was actually playing with that just before the call now. And so with Expo, all those things are there and ready to go. You don't need to integrate the libraries, deal with CocoaPods or other kind of configuration. So it's a great way to get started, and it's great if you don't have that native development experience and you just want to work with the JavaScript layer.
Yeah, I want to jump in here because definitely I agree that Expo is that first great step in React Native for beginners, and the API alone, because a couple years ago when I first started using React Native Maps and React Native Camera Roll, the installation was quite intimidating. So the fact that those are now rolled into Expo really abstracts a lot of the complexity and allows people to make some cool stuff happen.
Yeah, setup is a part of it. I might not stick with Expo for the side project that I just spun up this morning, but I'm doing a spike right now. It's an experiment because I haven't played with the Maps APIs before. And so just being able to have it ready to go right away in Expo is really nice. And then if I decide, okay, cool, like this works, this is the kind of app that I want to build, I might start over again with React Native CLI for reasons we'll talk about maybe when we get to that second approach.
Yeah, and in the article you point out, it's kind of has that startup feel where you kind of want that rapid development. So, I mean, one thing I think it is great for prototypes, like you said, for a side project. If you just want to get a proof of concept together, it doesn't need to be the full-fledged out app. But if you just want to show something to somebody and it's easy to deploy and share with others, this is definitely a tool I would recommend.
That's a good point about sharing. Expo has the ability for you to publish up your project, like there's a sort of JavaScript version of it. And then because I haven't done a professional project in Expo, I haven't quite wrapped my head around it. I know it used to be very open where you could just send a link to anybody else and they could open it up locally. I think Apple locked that down a bit. It's nice that they even let us run React Native. And so they are like, we don't want people just shooting JavaScript all over the place. And so I think you have to be logged into your own Expo account on iOS, but Android might still be more flexible for sharing links and letting others run it. Another piece that Expo has built in is over-the-air deployments, where you, if you've made updates to your application and it's not a new version of Expo, so there's no new native code, it'll handle deploying the updated JavaScript assets for you. So you don't need to go through an App Store release. Just the next time the user boots up your app, it'll download the new version of the JavaScript from Expo. And like many of these other things, there is a service to do that. Microsoft Code Push, which I think is now part of App Center, is a really popular one for other React Native flows. But when you're using Expo, you've got it built in out of the box as well. So it's nice.
Yeah, the thing that I found convenient was just, essentially using it to start up. And then, it had everything built in. I didn't have to go figure out how to pull it in.
Narendra, have you played with Expo before?
Oh yes. For me, Expo has been the best way to start with, mainly because it takes away the initial difficulties setting up your native infra, like the Xcode and everything around that. But I think after over time, if you feel you need more than what Expo provides, it also offers a very nice way to eject from Expo and then build on top of it. So that's something which I like about Expo. It's a perfect way to start with. And then it also provides the flexibility to move away from Expo and have your own code base. So even in my talk, which I gave earlier, I always advocate for Expo to start off with for any beginners, as it's very straightforward, starting from where React Native was earlier before Expo to what it is now.
Yeah, and I know when you were a guest on the podcast recently talking about push notifications, that's one of the services that I reach for Expo for the most. I have a blog post series coming out where I talk about push notifications and WebSocket notifications. And I built the front end in Expo just because it's just so nice and smooth to work that way across both platforms, which are, what's under the hood on iOS and Android is fairly different when it comes to push notifications.
That's right. The main thing which Expo really solves is you don't need to have two different APIs, or you don't have to worry about multiple platforms and how do you want to support that. So it's one API which internally abstracts the complexity of two platforms, and you just have to interact with one API. So that really helps in development.
So here's a question for y'all that I've thought about when I've thought about Expo. Some criticism for those outside the React Native community about React Native is like, there's platform differences. iOS and Android are different. Like cross-platform things, a number of native developers are kind of down on it from having been burned in the past. And a lot of folks point to early in React Native's history, maybe even in the initial announcement, they really emphasize this is not write once, run anywhere. This is learn once, write anywhere. And so really emphasizing it doesn't need to be the same code buff across both platforms. I wonder if in my head, I start to think about Expo kind of taking the position of, it actually can be mostly shared. Like you're mostly using JavaScript. You're mostly using, yes, it is offering the different APIs under the hood, but I feel like if you're building an Expo app, probably that's for a case where you're not anticipating a lot of differences between the two platforms, maybe visual tweaks, and you can put conditions and check the platform in there. But would y'all agree that Expo seems to be sliding more towards the sense of no, it's the same application. You write once and run anywhere. Is that the Expo mindset, would y'all say?
Yeah, I think it depends on how much you leverage the platforms package. But like we said, it seems like a lot of the applications that are being utilized for Expo, you're not doing anything super complex. So these are mostly simple applications where it kind of gives you the opportunity to have just a single code base. I don't know what you guys think about that, but it seems like Expo is built for your standard kind of form-based app where nothing really super fancy is going on.
Yeah, I think I would agree. That's a great insight. In some more recent thinking I've done on this topic is we were discussing internally as a company, like when we recommend React Native and what for, the idea of if you have an application where those native integrations, those native APIs are the whole core of it, like the whole point of it is you need to use a specific iOS, device thing or API, then maybe React Native CLI is better because you have that full native API access. But if it's like, oh no, push notifications are in there, but they're not essential. Like it's not the core of the application. The core of the application is, like you said, form-based. Like you're showing screens, you're pulling data off a web service, you're saving it back up. Then I think Expo addresses that core really well. And, Expo has native integrations. You can build simple form-based apps with React Native CLI. But yeah, it just depends on like what's the key thing that people are using your app for. Is it for the forms, the screens, the info being shown? Then I think Expo will definitely meet your needs.
Yeah, I think for sure whenever you're going in this process and determining what kind of tools you want to use, those are good questions to ask yourself. And, Expo might be the right fit for you, or, like Narinder said, it might be something you just kind of get started with and then you eject and then kind of iterate on it. But I think that, was a good segue into the React Native CLI because Expo and the React Native CLI are so tightly coupled. And, there's totally, instances where the React Native CLI is what you want. And your article does a good job for this at the beginning of each section. We determine when you should use this tool. So we know, obviously, Expo is something that's great for prototypes and beginners. But, your point for the React Native CLI, I kind of took away as it's the right tool for a seasoned web dev, or when you want a React Native app from scratch that you want complete customizability. Is that what you were kind of going for with this article, is kind of just taking the reader from, beginner to more advanced?
It wasn't the main thing that I had in mind, but I think it does come into it. I wanted to make sure, and, some of our comments might skew towards like the idea that we're suggesting that like Expo is not for production applications or that you would always move beyond it. And I don't know that that's the case. I think it depends on your company. But I think that the great thing about what you said about the fact that you can eject out of Expo into React Native CLI means you don't need to know that in advance. Like you don't have to go with React Native CLI to be safe because you never know if you're going to need a new native API. You can always switch to that point when necessary. Let me introduce React Native CLI just in case there's readers that don't quite follow the distinction, and then we can kind of get into it some more. So React Native CLI is sort of like the normal way, in a sense, which is kind of a funny way to say it, sort of the normal way to use React Native. So it's the tool provided by React Native itself natively. Although, as I mentioned, Expo is recommended in the React Native documentation as the easy way to get started. But React Native itself provides this React Native CLI. It lets you create a new React Native app. This app has your React Native JavaScript, as well as an iOS and an Android project inside it. And so if you've, any listeners, if you've had to install Xcode or Android Studio, you're using React Native CLI. So because it's like the most normal or standard or sort of like default way to use React Native, documentation you read is going to most likely apply to this scenario. Now, thankfully, like most of the biggest React Native libraries that I've seen have instructions for Expo and for React Native. So that's really nice that the adoption level is that high, where they say, oh, you have to perform these extra steps in React Native CLI or whatever. But to go back up to a high level, the thing about React Native CLI is you can work at that JavaScript layer and build out your form-based app and just kind of stay almost entirely in JavaScript. Or you can pull in third-party packages that have new native integrations that tie into separate iOS APIs, Android APIs. Anybody can publish one of those. Or in your app, you can write your own Swift code, or I guess Objective-C code or Java code to tie it into native APIs. So it really gives you the maximum flexibility. You aren't limited by what Facebook or what Expo has integrated with. As soon as Apple or Google release a beta that have a new API in their native code, you can wrap it, you can expose it to the front end and get access to it. And so that flexibility is really nice. It's not too hard to pass that information along and to wrap it. I have a few blog posts on that as well from a little while back. So this React Native CLI, I would say, is a good option if you already know you're going to need some kind of native integration that Expo doesn't provide. So that is definitely clear. The downside is like it's helpful. Like you'll need to know or you'll need to learn a little bit about Xcode and a little bit about Android Studio. You're going to need to be in there. You need to run the build processes. But if you want React Native CLI, you're probably going to need that sort of native knowledge anyways. But yeah, I think it's sort of a good default to go with once you're ready there, because that way you can say to your business, to your stakeholders, like, hey, we aren't boxed in. We have full access to the native APIs to build whatever we need to do. And so if that's important for you and for your application, then that's going to get you the maximum flexibility. What do y'all think about that summary?
That was a good summary. But since we're on the topic of the React Native CLI, I want to do a quick shout out to the Ignite CLI created by Infinite Red. It's an awesome tool, which is essentially the React Native CLI, but there's some commands to kind of add some structure to your app. So if you haven't used it, please check it out. It's a great tool and helps you kind of abstract some kind of best practices in your app. And they have some add-ins too for native base and React Native maps. And then that comes with a great sample app to kind of get you up and going if you haven't used the React Native CLI before. But to jump back into what you said, if you are a beginner and you're getting into the React Native CLI, some of the libraries, it seems intimidating because, if you want to add an Android package, you're jumping down to the build.gradle folder. You might be seeing some Java code you've never seen before, but a lot of libraries out there do such a good job for this kind of installation with both Expo and this. So like React Navigation, for example, has great documentation for different levels of React Native, less than 59 and greater, and where to actually modify that build.gradle or what CocoaPods to install. So if you are a beginner and you're here in the React Native CLI and having to jump into this native code, I wouldn't be too worried about it. Any kind of standard library you're going to use is going to have a great walkthrough of how to use it. I don't know if you guys have run into any other libraries that kind of has that same kind of vibe that helps with the installation. For the most part of stuff I've dealt with, I've never really had an issue with installation when it comes to actually jumping down into native code.
Yeah, no specific libraries come to mind for me, but that's definitely the sense that I've gotten. I try to stick with libraries that have fairly high adoption. Pretty well known amongst the community and things like that. And so those tend to have great instructions. The other thing too is when I start to run into an error that's kind of scary from the native code blowing up or not building or something like that, I almost always, if I just do a search, if I just Google, it'll almost always send me to an issue on the GitHub issues for that library where there's already discussion and process. And folks definitely jump in and help one another with different things to try to fix it. And so like the folks that are more knowledgeable about native code are definitely helpful there. I will say on the flip side, it is as you get to know the native platforms a bit better, it's helpful as well though. Like that way, you don't have to go to GitHub issues for every minor question that comes up. You see something and you're like, oh yeah, that's because I haven't run CocoaPods, right? Like the CocoaPods hasn't done its side of the installation. Or, oh yeah, I know I'm getting a syntax error in the build.gradle file. Like I know what's up with that. I didn't specifically intend to plug my company's courses, but Big Nerd Ranch is really known for our native development books and courses. And so I'll plop links in. I think, just buying our guide on iOS or on Android would be a really great, like $40, something like that. But it would just be a really great way to run through. You won't, as a React Native developer, you won't need everything in there day to day, of course, because they're walking through the basics of building a full native application of these platforms. But just having gotten familiar with the language, getting familiar with the build tools, I think it's a great orientation to give you answers and also just to make you feel comfortable that like you're not scared to go in and tweak a build Gradle file because you can get back to where you were and just kind of have some versatility there.
Yeah, I think familiarizing yourself with the technology around you is so significant, and specifically to React Native, just because you are crossing so many boundaries, you need that knowledge, especially when it comes to deployment, because at that point, if you're using the React Native CLI, there's no way to avoid any kind of using of the Xcode or Android Studio. And those are great tools to have in your belt to kind of help leverage and get your app deployed or kind of take your app to the next level. And, to jump back a couple moments ago, it enables you to use the native level. So if you do have that talent at your company, they can enhance your app by having, building their own library to kind of make theme, or not library, but custom add-on to enhance your app because you have access to that native code.
Yeah, this gives us something I think you mentioned early on and that I recommended, where I've heard just a common theme from experienced React Native developers that like, hey, if you have like one iOS and one Android developer on your team, like experience on those platforms, that's a huge help because they can handle the tricky errors that come up. They can build out some native integrations when necessary, and they can just supply you as the JavaScript developers with the stuff that you need. And so really React Native CLI is a great fit when you have a large web team, especially a React team, and you want to get into native development. You want those folks to be able to, use their time towards that and build out features for web and for native at the same time. But you just supplying a little bit of that native knowledge will go a long way to help really support your JavaScript developers.
Yeah, in my instance, I worked at a company where we had some people on site, and I started doing some React Native at home, and just having that knowledge around kind of made my life a lot easier, especially when it came to deployment to the App Store, because there is a little bit of a learning curve there if you've never done it before. But at this point now in time, there's ways to deployment is much easier, and there's a lot of documentation out there. But, getting around Xcode and getting your splash screen set up and, setting your app icon, those are all things that having that native developer around is really helpful. And once you kind of get in there and do it yourself, it's just like a nice skill to have.
Related to that, I think for developers in particular, I think this is maybe a helpful way to think about it. Your React Native CLI application, it's a native app that launches up, and it launches up a React Native view that inside there is going to run your React Native screens and all your JavaScript code. But the applications themselves are normal, custom native applications for yourself. So that's why setting up the icons is the same as usual. Provisioning, permissions from the OS to get this or that, and deployment is all done the same as usual. Whereas with Expo, those are some of those things that are abstracted away. So they build the application for you. And so they have a different configuration file where you specify an icon. And they, handle, that configuration file, I think, where you ask for your native permissions as well. So that is the level. It's even though you're mostly building React Native, but it's like you still have those native applications there and that iOS and that Android subfolder, fully. The plus side is you have full access to do in there what you need to do. The risk or the downside is you can mess things up if you're not careful, or you have the responsibility to do it as a part of your deployment and kind of just putting those niceties in that really make your app play well with the rest of the operating system. Narendra, Chris, any other things y'all want to talk about React Native CLI before we move on to the next approach?
No, I think the topic we've been on is actually the perfect segue into the next topic. I don't know if you have anything, Narendra.
No, I think we can go ahead to the next one. Yeah.
When I'm building a new product, G2I is the company that I call on to help me find a developer who can build the first version. G2I is a hiring platform run by engineers that matches you with React, React Native, GraphQL, and mobile engineers who you can trust. Whether you are a new company building your first product or an established company that wants additional engineering help, G2I has the talent you need to accomplish your goals. Go to devchat.tv/G2I to learn more about what G2I has to offer. In my experience, G2I is linked up with experienced developers that can fit my budget, and the G2I staff are friendly and easy to work with. They know how product development works and can help you find the perfect engineer for your stack. Go to devchat.tv/G2I to learn more about G2I.
So in the blog post, I titled the next one Existing Native App. You could say brownfield, although options 3 and 4 both kind of qualify for that. So in this approach, like if you have an iOS application, you have an Android application, and you're like, hey, we, for one reason or another, we would like to introduce React Native into it. The great news is that you can do it gradually. You don't need to do a rewrite. You can add React Native into an existing application. And that's one of the nice things about what I just said, the fact that React Native always runs in just sort of a standard native app anyways, is you can add it in. There's official information in the React Native documentation about integrating with an existing app on both sides, on iOS and on Android side. And so you can go in. You can probably, for a lot of apps, especially those form-based apps, utility apps, probably you have the native navigation options, like a tab bar or a navigation controller on iOS. And so just an individual screen on those could be implemented with React Native. You can pop into there, and that gives you a single place in the application to work. It's nice to experiment there, so you can see, hey, what is our development experience like with React Native? Do we like that? What's the user experience like, especially for really high profile apps where your application is your business and it's where your revenue comes from? You may want to make sure that the user experience is good, that it loads sufficiently fast, that users aren't getting turned away by the experience of React Native on a certain screen. And so really, just like with going from Expo and experimenting and being able to eject to React Native CLI, the path here is gradual as well. You could just have a single screen, like a new section, a new just information presenting section of your app is implemented in React Native. And then if you find that works well, you can switch more and more screens over to using React Native over time. And as you staff up, maybe you hire some more React Native developers, maybe you train up your native developers on React Native so that gradually you can move portions of the app over. So yeah, that's some of the gradual process of introducing React Native into an existing native app. I have experienced some gotchas though. I'm curious if y'all or people have tried to add React Native to a brownfield app in this way.
I actually have not done this. So this was one of the areas I was excited to talk about because I have heard, I think Facebook, this is how they obviously started introducing React Native into their app. I don't know which app it was, but I know that was kind of like the big segue into it. And this alone, I think is perfect. So this is the perfect scenario if you're at a company and you have, your native developers and they're a little overwhelmed and you have an influx of JavaScript talent. This is the way to kind of get out there and start working with React Native. But yeah, I obviously don't have any experience, but the React Native documentation really lays it out simply to where this isn't a difficult task. And, with a little bit of time, you can actually make a big impact on an existing native app.
Yeah, I think the situation, the business situation that I was thinking this would really be good for is you've got that native application, but something I consistently hear, and we hear from our clients at our consultancy, is that it's hard to hire native developers. There's just so many JavaScript developers everywhere, and React in particular, that it's just so easy to hire for. And if you already have React on the web, it's like those folks are right there. And so being able to bring your different platforms closer together can enable you to just kind of deliver the same experience across web and across native. So yeah, that can work out really well. I think the challenge that I've seen, this starts to get into those famous challenges that Airbnb shared about recently. I think it was last year, about why React Native did not work out for them as a company, or really they decided to move away from it. I think when you have a standalone from scratch React Native app, like the boundaries are clear. Like, cool, this is a React Native application. Everyone working in here understands they need to be using React Native, and so they're good to go. And you just kind of go from there. When you're adding it into a brownfield application, there can be challenges. I haven't done this in production, but for a hackathon, we did do this. We actually, I was building out some React Native screens, and then I had an iOS and an Android developer on my team who were building AR integrations actually with each of those platforms, augmented reality APIs. And so we each had different screens, and we wanted to make sure that they had like full access to do things natively exactly as they always would. And so we opted not to although we were creating a new app from scratch, we opted not to create it with React Native CLI, but instead to create an iOS app, create an Android app, and then use these native integrations. Wait, you know what? I need to correct myself. I'm wrong. We did use React Native CLI to start it. And so that way, all three apps were there from scratch. But there was a lesson here that we came to that applies to brownfield applications. And the lesson was React Native, even when you're doing a brownfield app and adding React Native to it, from a directory structure standpoint, React Native wants to be in control. And so, I could visualize a situation where you're like, hey, iOS developers, like, hey, we want to add some React Native to the app. Like, you'll be able to keep doing your things just the way you want. Cool. Okay, JavaScript developer, that's fine. Go for it. And I'm like, cool. Okay, the first thing I need to do is to take your application for iOS and put it in a subfolder. So we'll set it to the side over here, and then we'll put my React Native application at the root. As it just, politically, it just kind of comes across as kind of interesting. And it's because that's the way that React Native CLI is set up. It expects that iOS folder, the Android folder to be at the right place. The other thing we found was this running React Native in the native app was not transparent to the native developers. So And again, this was a hackathon, so this would be different in a production scenario. But in the 3 days we were working on it, as I was doing things and changing the React Native code, we'd merge down one of my PRs. And then one of my teammates would say, Josh, I can't build the app in Xcode anymore. What's going on? And I was like, oh, something changed with the React Native setup. You need to tweak this config file, or I need to troubleshoot this thing that's not running on your machine, that's running on mine. But these developers on iOS and Android that are experts in their platform, they're used to being in, it's not a matter of control. It's like they're used to being able to solve the problems that they get. And all of a sudden, React Native comes in and it's a whole different set of tooling. It's a whole different set of challenges that even if they're not touching it day to day, it still runs as part of the build process. And so they can get errors, they can get bug reports. And so that's just, I think that the general precaution that I would share is just know that React Native won't be transparent to your native developers. Like they kind of need to be on board with it being in the app and just being willing to help with and kind of go through some friction as y'all get it up to speed. So unfortunately, it's not a no downside experiment. Like there's risk for some speed bumps along the way. And so it's just something important to be aware of.
Yeah, that's an awesome point. And I think obviously anytime you're going to, take a new practice into the workplace, you need to look at the pros and cons. So here, obviously there is a significant learning curve and you're getting a lot of people involved. But, the obvious pro here is it takes code sharing to the next level. So, in terms, I know it was a hackathon, but when you guys were discussing features, I know you're in a little bit of a time crunch, but what was that scenario like having to be cross technology? And, because I'm sure that a Swift developer doesn't really work with a Kotlin or Android developer as much as, we think they do. They probably get the specs and, then they go their different ways and they apply like, okay, well, I know on Android, I want it to look this way and we want to use material. And then on the iOS, we want to have it look this way. So it's interesting to kind of think about that scenario, being in a hackathon, having, you, the JavaScript developer, kind of bringing these two technologies together. Was that something that, was a little bit of a detriment to the situation, or did you think it was more beneficial having just the multiple concept idea of having all these different technologies work towards a similar goal?
I think the upside was that we were able to get a lot more done than we otherwise would have, which is the common thing that you hear. We wanted, the idea was sort of like an app that we give to our clients for the projects that we're working on that help them to visualize how their project is progressing. And we have Jira and Pivotal Tracker, but something that's kind of fun to look at. It's a high level, how's your project going? How is it proceeding? And so we had the idea to use these AR features. And so those needed to be really cool. And we, at the time, both the AR kit and AR core on the respective platforms were brand new. And we didn't have, React Native integrations at that point. And so, I had these developers on my team that wanted to be able to do it, that had their experience on a native code. So for the AR features, those parts of the app, we wanted to go straight to the native code. And so this allowed them to do that there was not, we did not need to wait for stability, stability to come around. Those are not simple features to wrap with with a React Native wrapper. I think some folks have done it, some companies have done it now, but those are something where there was a lot of value at being first to market. There's a lot of value to say, hey, Apple's put this API out. It's beta or preview or experimental. We want to go to it right away. We want to try it out right now. So they were able to do those things where we really, really needed that native code. But then for the rest of the app, there was a lot of utility screens, form-based screens, dashboards. And so I was able to build out several different screens with that. Incidentally, this is the project where I first got to play with React Native's animation APIs. And that was really cool. It was so great declaratively just to be able to animate a little bar chart coming in. It looked really neat. And all these screens and it worked exactly the same on iOS and on Android. And so, they or we would not have been able to build two fully featured, apps of this kind in the 3 days that we had if we were building them separately on two different platforms. It's kind of a non-starter, especially for hackathons. So we're building one thing. And so it's either a one platform thing or a cross-platform thing. And so being able to use the native code in exactly the normal way for the parts of the app that really needed it, and be able to use React Native for everything where it was just screens. We're just showing data on the screen. We don't need to drop down to that level. The abstraction of React Native's UI components was exactly what we needed. It was a great best of both worlds.
Yeah, it's a really cool situation. And because it was a hackathon, it kind of removes some of the questions I or not removes, but I'm curious if this was in the workplace, how would we go about, how would testing work, the Git repo, it's, there's a ton there to unpack. So this could actually spawn its own episode, which would be pretty cool to talk about. But, in your scenario, were they just kind of dropping you their project, you pulled it into your iOS folder and you committed their changes, or how did that all pan out for you in that situation?
Yeah, so we use the directory structure as React Native CLI creates it. So you have your JavaScript stuff at the root, an iOS subfolder, and an Android subfolder. And so I just let them know, like, hey, like, here's the folder. It should be your normal project files. You should be able to work in there. Just like, for it, like they did need to have the whole thing checked out, not just a subfolder, to be able to run it, including React Native running and booting up. And so, like, when they did a pull request, they just forked the whole repo. And, the iOS developer was only making changes in the iOS folder, almost all the time. So, yeah, the normal React Native CLI folder structure worked pretty well. And again, just to tie this back to the third approach here, the brownfield approach, on my, hackathon, we weren't integrating with an existing native app. But this is the same approach that would work there. If you follow React Native's instructions, they include, hey, put the native app in this appropriate folder and then initialize it with React Native CLI. And so that workflow and like the directory structure would be the same if you do have an existing app that you're dropping React Native into.
Yeah, exactly. To point back to the article before we move on, I just want to point out, some of the benefits is if you have an influx of JavaScript talent in-house, this kind of gives you the opportunity to add new workflows that might be simple. Like you said, a couple forms or maybe just like a sign-up page. Nothing that would be too complicated for someone who's just getting started with React Native, and allow them to kind of contribute to your main production app and be completely separated without, affecting your code. And that's what's, obviously interesting about this approach. But I think we covered this pretty well. Are you guys ready to move on to the next topic?
I'm good. Yeah. Cool. So the fourth approach to React Native, actually, we should back up because, like I said, a fifth one has come out since I created this blog post. And maybe I haven't worked with it much, so we may not have much to say about it, unless maybe y'all have. Narendra may have. So Expo is working to create more and more options for developers. It's really cool. I mean, they are clearly committed to open source. I mean, they're just providing all this stuff for the community. And they're trying to find more ways for people to use Expo's code in different ways rather than locking developers in. That doesn't seem to be their desire at all. And so there's an Expo kit flow now, which I haven't used it myself, but my understanding is that Expo kit is sort of the core of Expo's libraries, the APIs they make available. And so what you can do is when you're you create an Expo app, and then you eject out of Expo to switch over to like a normal React Native app with access to your native code. That app will be set up with a dependency on ExpoKit, which is kind of the core, kind of the guts of Expo. And so the idea there is like you still have access to a lot of, I think most of Expo's APIs and different modules and things like that. There's a few that don't work out. I think push notifications is one of them, which is funny because that's one of the things that I like Expo the most for, which is why I often end up staying in Expo. But in that case, like it's a both and, where it's like you have a React Native CLI app, so you get all the flexibility that it provides, but you're also getting Expo Kit included. So a bunch of the out-of-the-box functionality that Expo provides is there for you. You don't need to, the main way I'd say it is you don't need to find those individual modules for each native integration you need, for each platform to pull in, but a lot of what Expo provides is there for you. So it's kind of a best of both worlds between Expo and React Native CLI. Have either of y'all worked with Expo Kit in CLI apps before?
No, not Expo Kit specifically, but I have been in the situation working with React Native CLI and kind of going through the process of researching libraries and setting them up and trying to figure out what's best for, the situation. Like I said, with, camera specifically, and then React Native maps. So obviously this is nice because they're pulling in, I think Expo uses React Native maps as the standard. But, if you were to go back in time, it obviously is a huge time saver because you're going to use a tool that is battle tested that other people are using versus, just going through NPM researching, and it kind of saves you on that research, that R&D time, if you will. and allows you to use a standard. And I love standards. I don't know about you guys, but when something's battle tested and you can go to the GitHub and see people talk about it, and there's documentation. And Expo has excellent documentation. So that's what I like about this approach specifically.
One of the biggest pieces of pushback I get from native developers is the dependency on these third-party libraries. And, as web developers, we're used to having lots of node modules and things like that. But it can be challenging when it's like you don't even have access to a certain native integration if your node module that integrates with that native library is not updated for the latest React Native or doesn't work with the latest version of iOS or Android. And so, this is making me realize that I think Expo can be a big part of how I advocate for React Native in those situations where I say it's like, hey, it's not a bunch of third-party integrations. It's mostly just the one. It's mostly just Expo, and they're tested with one another. These native developers, a lot of times, especially on the iOS side where there's not built-in, package manager tooling, I think it's maybe coming along, maybe not quite there yet. They're used to having everything available for them from the OS. And that's something similar to what Expo tries to provide as well. Cool. Let's go back to that fourth approach from my blog post. This is let me get up in front of the user phrase, component library. So this is creating a library that's used by your iOS app or your Android app, and React Native exists just within that library. And so this really does isolate React Native in one place so that your native developers don't need to get their hands dirty in React Native as much. So this gives you more isolation to really keep them freed up to do what they do best. Artsy is the organization that's really spoken about this the most. So they have a blog post linked from mine called Making a Components Pod, where they walk through it, how to create I assume one of the Artsy developers is the creator of CocoaPods, so I assume I'm pretty sure that's the technology they use there. So it's like you have this independent library, and the React Native build process runs as a part of that library. So when you publish it, you have already built it with React Native. And so at the point that it's pulled into your iOS app or your Android app, the dependency is there, it's set to go, and they don't need to run React Native tooling. And so that's the point where iOS developers, Android developers can keep doing what they're doing in exactly the same way as they always have. Minus they do need to have CocoaPods going, which not all iOS developers love, but it's sort of a fact of doing business a lot of the time. So this kind of keeps the native developers more freed up. And this is much more of an isolated experiment. If you can get this setup working, it's really low risk in the sense of, okay, if we pull in this CocoaPods dependency, we have this screen that runs here. But we could take it back out, and it wouldn't. One important point to what you mentioned, Chris, this doesn't change the directory structure of your iOS application. So you're just, you got your iOS application, you got your CocoaPods pod file, you just add this dependency in, and you're good to go. So there's less churn that way. The other thing that's important is that React Native is still running at runtime. So your JavaScript file is built, the React Native dependencies are packaged up in there, and so when that screen comes up, React Native is running, but it's just something that's not needed to boot up the application. They don't even need Node.js to be installed at all. So it's a much more normal. I shouldn't say much more. The native developers in the other brownfield approach are still running their app from within Xcode or running the app from within Android, but they're not going to see the Metro bundler pop up. They're not going to see an error if they haven't run yarn install yet. So that's kind of the extra isolation you get. I'm not sure if I've actually heard about anyone doing this on the Android side, just because Artsy is just using, last I heard at the time their post came out, they were just using React Native for the iOS side. And so they've really documented there. It certainly makes sense that it would be possible for the Android side, but I haven't played with that. I've just walked along with their instructions and confirmed that I could get a component pod running myself on the iOS side as well. Did I explain that approach well?
No, yeah, for sure. And there's a couple things I want to point out. I haven't messed with this at all either, like the last point. But similar to working with the existing native app, this comes with some pretty huge benefits as, giving you that isolated environment to utilize some of your JavaScript talent to kind of start experimenting with React Native. So having, there's sometimes you kind of get an app where a lot of the pages look a lot of the same. and you kind of get that component being shared throughout. And if you're just short on native developers, this is where React Native comes in nicely, just because React is so good at components and code sharing, and especially now with hooks, even the sharing of state logic. So, if you have a common form, like a sign up form, right? Everyone's going to have a username and password or whatever. You can, create the UI for this that will handle that state, and then just have that lock into, your existing native app. And if it doesn't work, you just drop the component. But, if it does work, now you have that pod that can be used throughout multiple applications, and you can configure it and use it for so many other use cases. So it's just such a cool approach, and I could totally see this becoming one of the things that React Native, it'll be a strength for, because, it allows you to kind of move project to project and reuse that code, and, reuse those tests, and it's just, reliable. So I don't know if, I know we talked about testing a little bit before the call, but don't you think testing is the perfect place for this too? Having that same set of tests so where it can apply to multiple projects and just have that kind of peace of mind and security.
Yeah, totally. I think thinking about the kind of testing that I do, component tests, running with Jest, with maybe Enzyme, or I recommend React Native testing library, those are running against your JavaScript directly. And so those don't execute in the native execution environment. So whichever the 4 approaches here you take, or if you end up migrating between them, your React Native testing library test would run just the same. So that's really cool that those come over that way. And as you find that you're switching things up, those tests can go with you. On the flip side, if you're doing end-to-end testing that's really booting up your app using Detox or Appium, like you and I were talking about before the recording, those actually boot your iOS and your Android application, and they interact with them as is. Like neither of those tools actually cares if you're using React Native or not. And so that's really nice, because that can confirm as you refactor things that things are still happening. Like, hey, I don't know what's running under the hood, but one way or the other, the correct, native text view component comes up, the correct button component comes up, and when I click it, the right thing happens. So yeah, that test coverage there can really give you confidence as you're playing with different approaches. Another example I could give is, as I'm going from this Expo experiment that I'm doing on my side project, and if I do decide that I want to go with React Native CLI instead, I might eject, or I might just create a new React Native CLI app and move the components over. But if I do that, then if I've written any component tests, those could come over as is. In this case, I probably wouldn't have written any end-to-end tests because it's just an experiment. But yeah, like the code, React components are just so simple and straightforward. And so that code is portable across these different approaches you take to React Native.
Hey folks, this is Charles Max Wood, and I just launched my book, The Max Coder's Guide to Finding Your Dream Developer Job. It's up on Amazon. We self-published it. I would love your support. If you want to go check it out, you can find it there, The Max Coder's Guide to Finding Your Dream Developer Job. Have a good one. Max out.
Yeah, I think that portability, especially with the way apps are today, things are moving so fast, and, I know where I work, you have a weekly build schedule. So anything that you can build once and test consistently, and as it changes, and it has that scalability to add test and just kind of have that peace of mind, is so important. And that's why I think this component approach is just so important, because it's just a nice way to kind of add on to an app, have that self-contained environment. So, if you do want to expand on that, you could then, start with this and then move into that existing native app approach we talked about before. Because, now you might have the experience and be a little bit more familiar with the native environment. So if you just started off with just building, a couple components, and then, you're able to evolve and kind of contribute more to an existing native app, then that kind of gives you the opportunity to open more doors. So this is definitely 3 and 4 blend together so well, or points 3 and 4, the existing native app approach and this component library. Yeah. Once you start one, you can easily move into the other. And so that's what was cool about this article, is having those ideas, because, there's such a big barrier to entry between all these different approaches. So as if you're a React developer and you want to get into the React Native realm, it gives you, there's so many opportunities to get in, especially if you're at a company that has a mobile app. But aside from these approaches, if you're a React Native, if you're a React developer wanting into React Native, what would you suggest would be the best way to contribute at your current company? Do you feel like it'd be exist in native app or the component library? What would you, encourage others to do?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it gets at one of the differences between these four different approaches. If I forget your question, bring me back because I can get off on rabbit trails. I think one of the differences as we proceed from approach 1 to 4, the approaches grow in terms of like sort of the build setup complexity. And so in Expo, like it's all JavaScript. Like you just run Expo start and you're good to go. With a React Native CLI, it's like, well, you have your apps there and you might need to clean out a cache in Xcode or do some configuration in Android Studio, but it's still mostly like running it just like the React Native documentation says. For an existing native app, option 3, there is official React Native documentation, but there, the instructions for like libraries you're integrating with don't usually mention this brownfield option. And so you may find that something about your native configuration is slightly different. And so there might be some challenges there. And for the component library, this approach is not even included in the React Native official documentation. And so it's not guaranteed that it's going to work just the same. I haven't tried it again recently to know if it's still working exactly the same or if things have tweaked. And it's not broadly talked about other than Artsy. And I'm not even totally sure if anyone has done this on the Android side. And so that's the thing where you could, like, building a component library is the least risky in terms of disrupting your native code, but it's the most risky in terms of if you're new to React Native and if you're new to native development, the component library approach is going to be the hardest for you to get started out. And so it would be easy for your company to miss out on the benefits that React Native provides just because none of you is familiar with the knowledge that's needed to kind of go beyond the React Native documentation to build out a component library. So I would actually caution people from doing the component library as their first thing. I would say certainly if you're wanting to learn React Native yourself, I would definitely recommend starting with Expo. Do example projects, do spikes experiments like I'm doing for my side project here. I've really enjoyed doing side projects in the last couple of years, even just throwaway things to get to know and learn different technologies. So, going into Expo is going to be the easiest way for you to get familiar with React Native itself and just what it's like to build in there. And so then you see, okay, cool. Like assuming the build setup was ready, this is how easy it would be to build up React components and have JavaScript and connect to our backend, and we'd be cool. And so maybe my recommendation would be even to build a Expo proof of concept to show people like, hey, here's what a screen in our app built in React Native could look like. Look at how I was able to style it to look like our existing native application. Like, look at how, quickly it starts up. It's not too bad. Like users wouldn't notice it. And then at that point, once you've gotten some buy-in to the idea of doing React Native development, maybe then you evaluate the other options in this list and say, okay, like, are we going to add this into the existing native app? Is that doable? Like, do we have a rewrite planned coming up soon anyways? Like, we're a startup and like we have our initial version, we need to do something better. And so therefore, we might be willing to have the rewrite happen in React Native CLI. So yeah, it's something that I don't have easy answers for because this stuff is complex. One thing I will say is, because React Native is really driven by the community, the React Native community is the name of the kind of organization, the GitHub organization that people who are doing various kinds of React Native open source are in touch about and supporting one another. And even the React Native CLI itself is open source. I mean, it's created and supported by the community. So Facebook uses different tooling internally for them to build React Native. And so the CLI that is set up for all of us to use is really originated and targeted in the open source world. And so I think there's an opportunity for a company to come in and to say, hey, this component library approach is great. Like, this is what we believe in. This is going to help people so much. We've already done it. Maybe someone like Artsy published their instructions for iOS. Maybe someone, if you've done it for Android, or you want to take the effort to figure out how to do it for Android, maybe you can publish instructions and let us all know. Maybe you want to create some tooling around automating this stuff. So there's kind of a supported tool where it's like, oh, here's the tool to run to create a React Native component library, and you're good to go. And we can all help one another out in kind of keeping this approach working. So there's still just so much opportunity for companies and individuals to really contribute in the React Native world because we are still in the early days and there's more benefits to have. So that someone wants to do that, that would be really awesome. But yeah, there's not easy answers. Like, it's not super obvious, and it's important to be aware of, like, don't overextend yourself and choose an option from this list that you're not ready for. It's going to lead to you and your company missing out on React Native because there's just more native knowledge than you have at this point. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was such a good point. As if you're a React developer at a current company and you want to contribute, it's kind of grabbing Expo, getting a proof of concept together and showing them like, hey, look how fast this is. You know what I mean? And then kind of gravitating towards these more complex approaches. So, and one of the things about the React Native CLI too, like you said, it's kind of, it's a tool that's open sourced and you can access it and see it. It's actually, I think, as of React Native 60, now the React Native community actually maintains it, and it's been moved out of React Native core. So now instead of installing it globally, you actually just do it through NPX, which I thought was interesting. I hadn't spun up a new project for a while. And I went and did that this weekend because I got a new laptop, and I was like, oh, don't I install this? And I was reading through the docs, and yeah, it's completely moved to NPX. So it's definitely there. That's what's the beauty of the React Native community, is kind of similar to Vue. I mean, though React Native does have a backing of obviously a huge company in Facebook, but there is a ton of community involvement. And, you know, if you are starting or you're in a situation where you want to use it more at work, there's a ton of resources out there to kind of figure out how to do that and make this work. And, you know, Expo alone has excellent documentation, but I think that was excellent point about, you know, progressing through the steps, starting with Expo and moving towards these more complex approaches. And it's only a matter of time before somebody leverages, you know, this component library approach for it to blow up, I think, too.
Yeah, I would agree. That's a really interesting observation that I hadn't made before, that the React Native community, in a sense, is more unified than the React community. In a sense, it's partially just because of the necessity of the tooling. I mean, you know, React on the web, you could build it with Webpack, build it with Parcel, like whatever you like, you know, Rollup, I guess. Some people are smart enough to do that. You know, there's all these different approaches. Whereas with React Native, it's like, hey, like, we're not just targeting a browser. Like, we got to build this infrastructure to run this stuff natively. And so, you know, there's the official CLI. And so that kind of unifies us a bit more and kind of gets us all running on the same setup. I should plug more often Reactiflux, the Discord community for React and React Native. So we'll put that in the show notes. But that's a great place to go. There's a React Native channel in there, as well as a few others, like for React Navigation and for Expo. There's an Expo channel as well. And so any questions you had, you can jump in there, and folks are happy to help out, as well as the other channels for you know, things like Redux related that are going to apply across React for the web and for React Native. But yeah, you know, lean on the community. Folks are excited about React Native and want to help out. You know, we want to help people have the option to build applications at this high level of abstraction. I believe in it so much, and I think it's just so productive and so beneficial. And I want React Native to continue to succeed more and more, just as we see more and more companies that are adopting it big time. Like you know, Microsoft, I think the new version of Office 365 is using React Native. They're investing in React Native for the Mac to kind of make that more of a standardized thing. So yeah, you have a community you can lean on.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the, like I said, the beauty of this is it's one of those things where you can kind of go out and talk with others and learn a lot from a small conversation online, you know, because it's a tool that's being leveraged in so many different ways. So everyone's experience feels different. I don't know, you know, like you said earlier, you're just messing with Expo on the side, and, you know, and my experience with Expo, I did it a couple years back, and it just kind of gave me that confidence to kind of get in there and try new things. So it's definitely, it's an excellent technology to be in.
Yeah. I guess it's sort of a wrap-up point. I just encourage folks, if you know, probably most of the listeners here may be developers. So if you're a developer trying to advocate for React Native at your company, or consider whether you would want to get into it, or maybe you are a decision maker, you know, non-technical person, but you're trying to decide if React Native makes sense, just think through these different approaches mentioned in the blog post. You know, when you think about downsides or risks that you've heard of, like, the build process is complex, or I'm limited, like we're not going to be able to write native integrations that we need to write. Just check out the different approaches to React Native to make sure you don't miss an opportunity. because there's just a breadth of options there that you don't get using the native platforms, and just all these different points along the spectrum where you can find the right trade-offs for your company and switch it up as you go. If you're at a startup and it grows, or if you're experimenting with React Native and deciding later whether you're going to really go all in on it, you have options to try it out. So don't be scared away because some people have downsides that you don't want to have, you can't have. Those may not be necessary for all the different approaches to React Native. So check out the blog post and ask for folks on Reactiflux, help people brainstorm with you, and maybe we'll find a way for you to experiment with it. Anything else, Chris, you want to talk about before we wrap up? I will say Narendra had to drop off, and actually Chuck had to drop off as well. So we appreciate them joining in the discussion. But it's just the two of us. So anything else you want to discuss before we head out?
No. I mean, I think we covered it all pretty well.
All right, let's go to picks. I have a few I'll start it with, and then you can jump in. So in the last month or so, the client project that I'm on, we've been experimenting with GitHub Actions and package registry. And so GitHub released these a while back, and they've actually, I think just in the last couple of weeks, have gone to general availability. So they were in beta before, and they're not in beta any longer. GitHub Actions, I thought of as a continuous integration service, analogous to Circle CI or Travis, and it does do that. I've heard that GitHub Actions does a lot more as well, and so there's ways to automate just about anything in GitHub's API you might want to do. So integrations with pull requests and automated things happening. So that's really cool. We're using it for CI right now. And just that, though, is really nice. I mean, for the basic usages that I have for most of the apps that I work on, I don't see any downsides with GitHub Actions versus Circle CI. And there's lots of upsides because it runs directly in the GitHub interface. All your information is there. Your permissions are all set up. So if you can see the repo, you can see the CI as well. The simple kind of YAML config files that you'd expect from other CI services as well. And then GitHub Package Registry, or I think they shortened it to GitHub Packages, is a way to publish packages on GitHub as opposed to on NPM itself, or on the analogous things for iOS or for Android. They have a Gradle and Maven. I guess Maven repositories is the right term for the Android side. Our client project is on React Native on Android, so we have some Android packages as well. And so if you have packages or maybe you haven't published packages because it needs to be private information, and you don't want to publish them on the public repo, and you don't really want to pay for another private service, GitHub has it there. It's been free so far, and but payment, they haven't decided on the payment, so that could be interesting to wait and see what they charge for it. But the organization with the client that I'm at already has a GitHub contract for GitHub Enterprise, and so having your packages published in the same place as well is nice and straightforward. There's just a little bit of NPM configuration or maybe configuration that goes in to tell it to pull your private packages from GitHub, and then all your regular packages come from the normal NPM or Maven repositories as you would expect. So we found that it's really simplified things to give our development team more autonomy to really have the knowledge and the access that we need to get our independent packages running. And, we were talking about code sharing before. When everything's set up in one place, it's much easier to say, hey, let's pull out this code and let's share it and make it reusable. So we've had great experience with GitHub Actions and Package Registry. I'll find some links to put in the show notes real quick so people can get started there. But if you don't have a CI or a private package set up yet, or you aren't satisfied with yours, it can be worth giving a try. The other pick that I'll recommend is a series of books called Exploring JavaScript by Dr. Axel Roschmeyer. He has a blog as well, but he also has these books, and they are free to read online, or you can pay, nice, small amount to get ebook versions of the books. But his writing is absolutely my go-to place for learning the latest JavaScript features. I've really only got into front-end development in the last few years, and so his resources were the most helpful thing that I learned to learn about all the latest JavaScript functionality. So if you haven't yet learned about async await, or you're not totally confident, I'm always sending folks to his information on promises for folks that know, we're used to the basics of how promises work in JavaScript, but maybe there are edge cases. Like, why do I need to do this in my tests? It's like, why do I have to do a then after I do a catch? What's going on there? So his writing is really clear and really thorough. So and he's got a new book now that's kind of putting it all together. So even if you don't have years and years of experience in JavaScript, you get up to speed rapidly with the latest versions of the functionality that that Babel makes available for us on React Native and on the web. So yeah, for learning JavaScript, Axel Rauschmeier's stuff is the go-to that I point people to. How about you, Chris? What picks do you have, if any?
Yeah, so I like to pick the free learning resources are always amazing. And I know Kyle Simpson has that same GitHub access to his books for the You Don't Know JS series. So if you don't have that, check that out. But my picks, I kind of spoiled one earlier with the Ignite CLI. So I mean, I've used it, and I recommend it because it gives such a nice just directory structure and kind of gets you set up with such good best practices, and it's easy to use and kind of just pushes you in the right direction. And if you're learning React or learn React Native, it comes with a nice little sample app and shows you structure and kind of helps you get going in the right direction. So that's my first pick. My second one is by Infinite Red as well. It's called Reactitron, and it's a desktop app for inspecting your, just project in total. And it integrates with Redux and Sagas and API sauce, and you can view your async storage. And there's even a plugin for linking Storybook to a React Native app. So it's just such a cool tool. I've used it on one app, and it was one of my first ones that I was kind of getting started with Redux in, and it just made the process a lot easier and visual. So if you're a visual person, like to see the state change and kind of mess with values and see how it affects your app, it's a great tool to utilize. So I definitely recommend that as well. They have a lot of great docs on how to get started and quick starts for both React and React Native, and how to track errors and just overall how to just get it set up in your app really well. So definitely check that out. It's just such a cool thing to work with and makes your life a lot easier in the long run.
We have a lot in common because all of those I have used before, and I like all of those as well. So
yeah,
I concur with your recommendations.
Yeah, they're awesome.
I put in the show notes for Kyle Simpson. I know of his books. I haven't read them, but I did take his front-end master's course, Deep JavaScript Foundations. And so that is, if you want a course or video or audio content for learning JavaScript, that course is what I'd recommend. And in particular, at least in the version of the course that I watched, it didn't cover all of what his books cover, but just a few keys about his JavaScript scope. And I think, I'm going to forget what it was. I think the type system and types and casting and things like that. And there was one other aspect of JavaScript that I forget. But yeah, like it's exactly what it says on the tin. Like I felt like I understood what was going on under the hood in JavaScript so much more clearly, and it was very practical for understanding why things were working or not working in my code, or to suggest better ways to organize my code. So yeah, Kyle Simpson and Axel Rauschmeier are both really, really great stuff. Cool. Was that your last pick?
Yeah, that was it for me.
Cool. Well, with that, I think we'll bring it to a close. So thanks everyone for joining us for another episode of React Native Radio. Thanks to Chris and Narendra for joining us as panelists this week, and I look forward to seeing them more in future episodes as well. So we will catch everyone again next week with another episode. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.